we are holding our own. Those were the final 5 words ever transmitted from the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, not a cry for mercy, but a chilling, static-choked prelude to a natural execution. At Whitefish Point, the North American continent reaches out a jagged finger of iron, creating a lethal funnel that transforms Lake Superior into a 200-mile wrecking ball. For over 150 years, this bottleneck of death has served as the critical pulse of the global iron trade, yet it remains the ultimate freshwater abyss, claiming over 240 steel titans. Today, we dive into the heart of the Great Lakes' deadliest corridor. Why does this specific geographical finger continue to defy modern radar, and what secrets lie buried in its ice-cold, eternal silence? We are searching for one haunting truth. In the silent war between man's iron and the lake's fury, why does Whitefish Point always have the final word? I am certain that the revelations in today's journey will not disappoint you. Stay with us until the very end to witness how this stretch of water broke the unbreakable titans and why it never lets go of its dead. From an aerial perspective, Whitefish Point appears as a jagged, iron-rich hook of land jutting out from Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It is more than a landmark. It is the most critical and dangerous crossroads in North American maritime history. Every vessel transporting iron ore from the massive western ranges of Duluth or Two Harbors must converge at this exact coordinate to find passage toward the Sioux Locks. It is a classic geographical bottleneck. While the open expanse of Lake Superior can reach 160 miles in width, the safe shipping lanes at Whitefish Point compress into a claustrophobic corridor. For the Lakers' mammoth bulk carriers, often exceeding 700 to 1,000 feet, navigating this point is the nautical equivalent of threading a needle in the middle of a hurricane. During a gale, these behemoths lose the luxury of maneuverability. They cannot simply run for open water. They are forced into the shallow, turbulent approach of Whitefish Bay to seek shelter. It is precisely in this desperate maneuver that many meet their doom. But Whitefish Point is not just a coordinate on the map. It is a convergence point for some of the most extreme phenomena nature can produce. To understand why massive ships become so small before these waters, we need to analyze the 3 deadly characteristics that have shaped its haunting reputation. The first threat does not lie on the surface of the water, but is hidden beneath the hull of the ship. Just north of the point lies the most feared geological feature in the Great Lakes, the Six Fathom Shoal. In maritime parlance, a fathom is exactly 6 feet. Therefore, a 6-fathom shoal implies a depth of a mere 36 feet, roughly 11 meters. For a small fishing boat or a pleasure craft, this is an ocean of water. For a fully loaded iron ore carrier like the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, it is a death sentence. When we examine the math of disaster, the margin for error disappears. When the Fitzgerald left port, she was sitting deep in the water with a draft of nearly 30 feet. In the calm of a harbor, she maintained a 6-foot safety margin between her keel and the lake bed. However, in the heart of a November gale, the physics of the lake undergo a violent transformation. Waves in this region can easily crest at 30 to 35 feet. As a ship crests one of these monsters and plunges into the trough, a movement known as pitching the bow and stern are momentarily suspended, while the center of the ship undergoes massive structural stress. In that downward surge, the distance between the steel hull and the jagged rocks of the shoal shrinks to mere centimeters. At a cruising speed of 14 knots, even a glancing blow against the shoal wouldn't just dent the hull. It would rip through the steel like a hot knife through wax, flooding the cargo holds before the crew could even realize they had been breached. Second, the danger of this terrain is compounded by a phenomenon known as fetch. Fetch is the distance over which wind blows across open water without any obstruction. Lake Superior provides a fetch of over 200 miles from the west-northwest directly toward the point. When a November witch storm blows in, the wind has hundreds of miles to build momentum, pushing a massive unchecked wall of water toward the eastern shore. By the time that energy reaches Whitefish Point, it is compressed by the narrowing geography, resulting in waves that are significantly taller, steeper, and more violent than those found in the middle of the lake. Furthermore, there is a fundamental lethal difference between an ocean storm and a Great Lakes storm. Ocean waves have a long period, meaning there is significant time and distance between crests, allowing a ship to rise and fall naturally. Lake Superior's waves are short period. They are steep, jagged, and strike with the frequency of a jackhammer. This leads to a catastrophic effect called pounding. Before a ship's bow can recover from being submerged by one wave, the second and third are already crashing over the deck. This is the scientific origin of the terrifying Three Sisters legend. 3 rogue waves that hit in such rapid succession that they effectively trap the ship underwater. Under the weight of thousands of tons of freezing water on the deck, the structural integrity of the ship fails. The vessel doesn't just sink, it is driven straight into the lakebed by sheer hydraulic force. Finally, if the waves fail to claim a ship, the ghost fog often finishes the job. This is not ordinary mist. It is a product of extreme thermal contrast. Even in late autumn, the depths of Lake Superior remain a constant 39 degrees Fahrenheit. When warm, moisture-laden air from the south hits this massive cold liquid mass, it creates a fog so dense it can swallow a 700-foot freighter in seconds. For 19th century sailors, it meant total blindness and certain collision. For 20th century sailors, it meant radar clutter, a phenomenon where the density of the mist and the spray from the waves create ghost images on the screen, making it impossible to distinguish between a rogue wave, a rock, or an oncoming vessel. These 3 geographic and physical characteristics have created an unforgiving, natural meat grinder. Yet amid that chaos, an iron sentinel has stood firm for more than a century, guiding lost souls, the Whitefish Point light station. If you look closely at its construction, you will see it is unlike the iconic brick lighthouses of the Atlantic coast. This tower is a skeletal cage of cast iron. The engineers of 1861 understood a brutal truth: brick is brittle. In a 90-mile-per-hour winter gale, the vibration of the wind and the impact of the spray would crack the mortar of a masonry tower within years. The iron frame design allows the lighthouse to flex and vibrate with the wind without fracturing, a masterpiece of 19th century industrial engineering. The history of this light is as heavy as the iron it was built from. In 1861, at the height of the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln personally signed the order for this lighthouse's reconstruction. It was a move of cold, calculated necessity. Without the iron ore flowing from the Lake Superior mines through the Whitefish Point bottleneck, the Union's factories would stop, the railroads would freeze, and the war effort would collapse. This lighthouse was not built for beauty. It was the garrison of the North, protecting the literal lifeblood of the American economy. And as we dive deeper into the history of this graveyard, we must address a chilling scientific reality. Why are the wrecks of Whitefish Point so hauntingly well preserved? When divers reach ships that sank 150 years ago, they find the white paint still bright on the hulls and the names of the vessels perfectly legible. The secret lies in the chemistry of the abyss. First, there is no salt. Unlike the ocean, which eats away at wood and steel through galvanic corrosion, the fresh water of Superior is neutral. Second, and more importantly, is the temperature. At the bottom of the lake, the water is a constant 39 degrees Fahrenheit, the exact temperature of a commercial refrigerator. In these conditions, the bacteria responsible for decay cannot survive. This leads to the most somber truth of the graveyard of the Great Lakes. For the sailors who went down with their ships, the lake became a permanent liquid tomb. Without bacteria to produce the gases that normally cause a body to rise to the surface, the victims of these wrecks never float. They remain below, preserved like wax figures in a frozen moment of history. As the local maritime saying goes, Superior never gives up her dead. Every perfectly intact railing and every unweathered deck is a monument to a tragedy that hasn't faded with time. As the 19th century gave way to the era of steel, the lake was preparing a lesson in humility that no shipbuilder could have foreseen. By the late 19th century, the maritime world stood on the precipice of a total industrial metamorphosis. The age of wood and wrought iron materials that had defined human seafaring for millennia was dying. In its place rose the cold, gleaming promise of steel. Launched in 1890, the SS Western Reserve was the ultimate testament to this revolution. Spanning 301 feet, she was one of the first true steel giants to grace the Great Lakes. Her owner, the Cleveland shipping tycoon Peter Minch, held such absolute confidence in the vessel's unyielding strength that he broke maritime custom. He chose to use the ship not just for the cold machinery of commerce, but as a safe passage for his own family. In August 1892, Minch embarked on what was intended to be a celebratory summer voyage, bringing his wife, his 2 young children, and his niece. On the evening of August 30th, the Western Reserve was cruising through the crystal-clear waters of Lake Superior, roughly 60 miles west of Whitefish Point. The conditions were deceptively benign. No gale-force winds, no blinding snow, only a moderate swell. But as the hull sliced through the 4 degrees Celsius water, a sound like a massive crack of thunder tore through the vessel. To the horror of the crew, the invincible steel did not bend or buckle, it shattered. The Western Reserve snapped in two like a dry biscuit. In less than 10 minutes, the pride of the Minch fleet was gone, swallowed by the abyss. The true tragedy, however, unfolded in the surf. While the family managed to board a lifeboat, a rogue swell capsized the craft just as they neared the safety of the shore. Peter Minch watched his entire family vanish into the freezing surf. Of everyone on board, only one man, wheelsman Harry Stewart, survived the grueling swim to the beach, carrying a story of structural failure that the world initially refused to believe. How does a brand new steel titan simply disintegrate in fair weather? The answer lies in a fatal flaw of 19th century metallurgy that would fundamentally rewrite the laws of shipbuilding: brittle fracture. At the time, steel was mass-produced using the early Bessemer process, a method that resulted in metal with dangerously high concentrations of sulfur and phosphorus. Metallurgists of the era did not yet understand that when this specific grade of steel is exposed to the unique near-freezing temperatures of Lake Superior, its molecular behavior undergoes a radical catastrophic shift. In warmer waters, this steel remains ductile, meaning it can absorb energy by bending and stretching under stress. But once it hits a critical low temperature, it reaches a ductile to brittle transition. It becomes brittle, behaving more like glass or cast iron than modern steel. Forensic reanalysis suggests that as the Western Reserve struck a moderate swell, the hull was forced to flex. In a ductile state, the steel would have absorbed the tension. But in the 4 degrees Celsius refrigerator of Superior, the high-sulfur steel was compromised. A microscopic crack, likely originating near a rivet hole, propagated across the entire midsection of the ship at the speed of sound. This was not a traditional sinking, it was a structural explosion. This disaster forced the entire maritime industry to abandon Bessemer steel for open hearth steel, a more refined material that offered the ductility needed to survive the Great Lakes. Every modern vessel on the water today carries a lineage of safety written in the blood of the Minch family. By November 1919, the lessons of metallurgy had been integrated, but Lake Superior was finding new ways to reclaim its dominance. On November 22nd, a massive blizzard, with sustained winds exceeding 70 miles per hour, turned the Whitefish Point corridor into a chaotic liquid tomb. The SS Myron, an aging wooden freighter towing a heavily laden barge, found itself trapped in the Bottleneck as the Witch of November took hold. As freezing spray turned into thick, heavy layers of ice on the Myron's deck, the vessel began to lose its center of gravity. The relentless pounding of the waves eventually breached the hull, and water flooded the engine room, extinguishing the boiler fires and leaving the ship dead in the water. Nearby vessels, including the SS Adriana, rushed to the scene, but were forced to watch in helpless agony. The waves reached heights of 25 feet, smashing any lifeboats against the Myron's wooden side before they could be launched. The crew was swept into the sub-zero water, where they lost consciousness within minutes. Captain Walter Neal, adhering to the ancient code of the sea, refused to leave his post, retreating into the wooden pilot house as the ship made its final vertical plunge. As the Myron sank into the 60-meter abyss, a freak occurrence of physics took place. While the heavy iron machinery and the waterlogged hull were dragged downward by gravity, the wooden pilot house, an airtight chamber filled with a pocket of trapped oxygen, remained stubbornly buoyant. As the water pressure increased at depth, the structural bolts holding the pilot house to the deck finally sheared off under the immense upward hydraulic force. In a scene that defies maritime logic, the entire pilot house exploded off the deck and shot back to the surface like a gargantuan cork. Captain Neal, who had braced himself for a watery grave, suddenly found himself sailing on a detached wooden island in the middle of a killer storm. He remained huddled inside that floating cabin for 20 grueling hours, drifting through the sub-zero night toward the Canadian shore. When he was finally rescued, frozen but alive, his survival became known as the miracle of the graveyard. It remains a stark reminder that at Whitefish Point, the lake can take everything in a second, but on the rarest of occasions, it provides a loophole in the laws of nature. Beyond the verified history of metal and miracles lies a phenomenon that bridges the gap between hard science and the supernatural. For decades, sailors navigating the Whitefish Point corridor have reported a recurring anomaly: the ghost ships of the radar. Modern navigators equipped with state-of-the-art solid-state radar and GPS often report a massive blip appearing on their screens, a vessel traveling at high speed on a direct collision course. When they peer out into the ghost fog, there is nothing. No lights, no wake, and an eerie silence. Scientists offer a rational explanation: radar clutter. In the unique microclimate of Whitefish Point, the dense concentration of ice crystals in the fog, combined with a thermal inversion called fata morgana, can cause radar waves to bounce off the atmosphere and reflect a mirage of a ship. It is an electronic illusion created by the lake's extreme temperature gradients. However, ask any seasoned captain who has spent 30 years on the lakes, and they will tell you a different story. They believe these aren't software glitches, but spectral echoes of ships like the Western Reserve or the Maritime vessels that were destroyed so violently that the lake itself hasn't finished processing their presence. Whether it is a quirk of physics or a lingering memory of the dead Whitefish Point, remains a place where the barrier between the past and the present is as thin as a sheet of ice. But these individual tragedies were merely a prelude. In 1975, the ultimate test of man's hubris would arrive in the form of a 729-foot Titan. It was a ship supposed to be the safest ever built, but the Witch of November was waiting with a trap that no one would survive. On the morning of November 10th, 1975, a meteorological anomaly began to materialize over the central United States, drifting with predatory intent toward the Great Lakes Basin. While regional weather bureaus technically classified the system as a deepening low-pressure cell, the seasoned mariners on Lake Superior, already feeling the barometric pressure plummet with agonizing speed, knew they were witnessing the physical incarnation of the Witch of November. To understand why this specific storm achieved such legendary lethality, one must examine the deadly convergence. A massive, bone-chilling Arctic air mass from the Canadian interior lunged southward, colliding head-on with a warm, moisture-laden front pushing aggressively north from the Gulf of Mexico. When these two diametrically opposed forces collided over the still unfrozen, relatively warm waters of Lake Superior, they triggered a violent phenomenon known as meteorological bombogenesis. The atmospheric pressure did not merely drop, it plummeted at a staggering rate of nearly 1 millibar per hour, creating a massive atmospheric vacuum. This void sucked in shrieking winds from across the North American continent, focusing their fury into the eastern corridor of the lake. By late afternoon, the storm had achieved a terrifying maturity. Sustained winds at Whitefish Point reached a steady 70 miles per hour, with localized gusts shrieking through shipwreckings at 90 miles per hour. In the confined, shallow basin of the eastern lake, these winds did not just blow. They sculpted the surface into massive vertical walls of water exceeding 35 feet. These were not the rolling, predictable swells of the Atlantic. These were jagged, short-period precipices of liquid weight. At this moment, Lake Superior ceased to be a body of water and became a localized oceanic battlefield. Nature was no longer an obstacle. She was preparing a cold-blooded structural execution of anything caught in her path. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald, a 729-foot Titan and the pride of the American side, was the largest ship ever to go down on the Great Lakes. Carrying a staggering 26,116 tons of taconite iron ore, she was racing against a closing window of survival to reach the relative sanctuary of Whitefish Bay. Trailing approximately 10 miles behind her was the SS Arthur M. Anderson, a vessel that would eventually become the primary witness to the Fitzgerald's final moments. The drama of the evening intensified as a catastrophic series of technical failures began to strip the Fitzgerald of every modern defense she possessed. First, the radio beacons at Whitefish Point, the critical navigational eyes for the entire region, were knocked offline by the sheer intensity of the blizzard. Shortly thereafter, Captain Ernest McSorley's voice crackled over the radio with a chilling update. Both of the Fitzgerald's radar systems had failed. In a world of blinding snow squalls, 90-mile-per-hour winds, and freezing spray that turned the ship's superstructure into a monolithic island of ice, the massive freighter was now effectively blind in the deadliest corridor of the lakes. McSorley was forced to rely on the Anderson to shadow them, via radar receiving course corrections over the radio, like a blind man being led through a minefield by a distant voice. As the Fitzgerald approached the treacherous Bottleneck of Whitefish Point, her lack of radar proved fatal. To avoid other vessels and maintain what he perceived as a margin of safety in zero visibility conditions, McSorley drifted significantly north of the standard shipping lane. This maneuver inadvertently placed the heavy freighter directly over the Six Fathom Shoal. Under the immense weight of her cargo, the Fitzgerald was undergoing extreme hogging and sagging, a structural nightmare where the bow and stern are supported by wave crests, while the middle hangs unsupported in the trough, or vice versa, causing the hull to flex like a giant spring. It is the widely accepted theory of forensic investigators that, in one violent downward surge, the Fitzgerald's keel, already stressed to its absolute limit, struck the jagged rocks of the shoal. The hull was breached silently beneath the thousands of tons of ore. Water began to flood the cargo holds from below a hidden internal wound that made the ship lethally heavy and increasingly unresponsive to the helm. She was sinking from the inside out, and the crew, focused on the chaos of the surface, likely did not yet realize the ship was already dying. How does a ship as massive as the Fitzgerald, a vessel longer than 2 football fields, vanish without a single mayday? The answer lies in the most terrifying hydrological phenomenon of the Great Lakes, the Three Sisters. This phenomenon involves 3 rogue waves, each exceeding 30 feet, striking in such rapid rhythmic succession that a ship has no physical time to recover. The first wave crests over the deck, pinning the stern down under thousands of tons of freezing water. Before the ship can rise to shed that weight, the second sister strikes, adding an impossible hydraulic load. Finally, the third sister, the largest and most violent of all, delivers the finishing blow. Forensic engineering suggests that at exactly 7:10 p.m., the structural limit of the steel was reached. The Fitzgerald did not just sink, she dived. The combined weight of the water on the deck and the shifting iron ore inside caused the bow to pitch down at such a steep angle that the ship's engines actually drove her straight into the lakebed 530 feet below. The ship snapped in two instantly upon impact. There was no time to launch lifeboats, no time for a final distress call. At 7:10 p.m., just minutes after McSorley's final famously calm radio transmission, "We are holding our own," the Fitzgerald's blips simply blinked off the Anderson's radar. No explosion was heard over the roar of the gale. No scream was recorded. There was only the eternal freezing silence of the black water. For 20 years, the Fitzgerald lay undisturbed in 2 massive mangled pieces at the bottom of Lake Superior, serving as a liquid tomb for her 29 crewmen. In 1994, a specialized expedition was launched, guided by the families of the lost. The mission was not for salvage or profit, but for a sacred memorial. Divers successfully recovered the ship's 200-pound bronze bell, replacing it at the wreck site with a new bell engraved with the names of the fallen. On November 10th, 1995, exactly 20 years after the disaster, that original bell was rung at the Whitefish Point Shipwreck Museum. It tolled 29 times, a deep, resonant bronze echo for each sailor who remains at the bottom of the lake. That sound was more than a tribute. It was a thunderous, metallic reminder of the price of human hubris. The bell is now on permanent display, still bearing the scratches, dents, and scars from the Witch of November, a silent bronze witness to the legend of the ship that never returned. The tragedy of the Fitzgerald left a deep permanent scar on the maritime soul of North America. It forced a total, uncompromising overhaul of safety standards, from the reinforcement of hatch covers to the mandatory use of survival suits. But 50 years later, as we look out across the cold expanse of Whitefish Point, the question remains, has the Witch of November truly been tamed by our technology, Or are we simply waiting in the mist for the lake to remind us once again who truly rules the Great Lakes? Whitefish Point is far more than a mere geographical landmark. It is the silent epicenter of the Whitefish Point Underwater Preserve. Within these cold, dark boundaries lies a phenomenon that is as eerie as it is statistically staggering: the overlapping graveyard. Because of the mandatory maritime bottleneck, we analyzed earlier vessels from entirely different centuries, separated by vast leaps in technology and culture, have chosen the exact same coordinates as their final resting place. Here, the floor of Lake Superior is not just a seabed, it is a vertical archive of human failure. Consider the proximity of the SS Vienna, which foundered in 1892, and the steel-hulled Nipigon. In certain sectors of the preserve, these wrecks lie so close to one another that they form a haunting submerged labyrinth. But it is the visual contrast between them that provides the most profound insight. Observe the wooden vessels of the 1800s like the Vienna. They emerge from the darkness as ghost ships frozen in time. Because Lake Superior is a pristine freshwater environment devoid of the salt that corrodes metal and the wood-boring organisms that devour ships in the ocean, these wooden hulls remain structurally intact. Every grain of timber, every mast, and even the original hemp ropes remain visible after 130 years of submersion. In chilling contrast, the modern steel wrecks often appear as unrecognizable piles of twisted debris. This presents a profound maritime irony. Steel is undeniably stronger against the surface scale, but once it succumbs to the abyss, it leaves behind a mangled wreckage of surrendered hubris. The wood, conversely, chooses a path of eternal integration, surrendering to the cold water only to be preserved by it forever. When a leviathan, like the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, makes its final plunge to a depth of 160 meters, the catastrophe does not conclude with the impact on the lakebed. We must examine the brutal reality of hydrostatic pressure. At 160 meters, the water exerts a force of approximately 16 atmospheres, that is 16 times the pressure we feel at sea level, or roughly 235 pounds per square inch. For a ship to sink peacefully, every internal compartment must be flooded with water. However, if air remains trapped in a hull or engine room as it descends, those air pockets become lethal. The immense external pressure of Lake Superior crushes these inch-thick steel bulkheads in a fraction of a second, triggering violent underwater implosions. This is the forensic reason why the stern sections of many Whitefish Point wrecks are not just broken, but shredded and twisted like discarded aluminum foil. The lake does not just drown a ship, it physically deconstructs it through the sheer weight of the water column. The blood of the hundreds of sailors lost at Whitefish Point has become the ink used to write the modern laws of the sea. Out of these tragedies, several life-saving legacies were born. Following the Fitzgerald investigation, global maritime regulations were tightened regarding the thickness, locking mechanisms, and structural integrity of hatch covers. Engineers realized that even a microscopic gap in a seal could allow enough water into a taconite cargo to turn the ship into a leaden anchor in minutes. Furthermore, the universal adoption of EPIRBs and self-deploying life rafts are direct consequences of the radar blindness and desperate silence of past crews. Today, no vessel is permitted to leave a Great Lakes port without carrying these safety legacies, standardized protocols that were paid for by the lives lost in the graveyard of the Great Lakes. Despite our technological advancements, modern meteorologists warn that Whitefish Point is facing a new unpredictable adversary: climate change. Lake Superior is warming at a rate nearly 3 times faster than the global average for oceans. This thermal shift is causing the winter ice cover, which historically acted as a lid to dampen wave energy, to disappear. Without ice to stabilize the surface, winter storms gain massive energy from the open water. This results in the Witch of November no longer being confined to a single month. We are seeing steeper, more chaotic waves and meteorological bombs occurring throughout the winter season. The lake is becoming more volatile, reminding us that our 20th century safety standards may soon be tested by 21st century environmental extremes. We conclude our journey at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point. This is not merely a repository for rusted artifacts like the Fitzgerald's bell. It is a sanctuary for the memory and honor of those who chose the lakes as their life's work. Every year, thousands of visitors stand before the iron frame lighthouse, looking out at the slate-gray expanse of Lake Superior. They come here to remind themselves of a fundamental truth. Man can build machines of steel and fire that defy imagination. But in the face of the Great Lakes' raw elemental fury, our greatest shield is not technology, it is humility. We do not conquer Lake Superior, we simply navigate it with her temporary permission. Whitefish Point will forever remain a mournful note in the symphony of maritime history. Those wrecks overlapping one another in the darkness below are not just ruins, they are lessons that never grow old. They tell a story of a nation built on iron and the heavy price paid to move it. Thank you for joining us on this 40-minute journey into the heart of the Great Lakes Graveyard. We leave you with one final thought. With all of our modern radar satellite GPS and reinforced hulls, have we truly mastered these waters, or are we simply enjoying a brief moment of mercy from a lake that never gives up her dead? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Finally, thank you for standing with me through the freezing mists of Whitefish Point. If this journey moved you, like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you in our next deep dive. Respect the water, and goodbye.